A peasant family wakes before dawn in the French countryside. The father walks to a field he does not own. He plants grain he will not fully keep. His wife bakes bread using flour, taxed 3 times before it reached their door. Their son, 16, cannot leave the village to find work in the city without risking fines or losing access to common resources. This is not a story about suffering. This is a description of how an economy structured daily decisions for roughly 26 million people in the 1780s. They were not starving. Most years, they ate. But the gap between survival and collapse was thin, and it was not shaped by personal failure. It was shaped by who owned what, who paid for what, and how the state extracted resources from an economy that could not grow fast enough to sustain those extractions. At the time, this arrangement seemed ordinary. Peasants worked land they rented. Nobles collected payments, but were exempt from most taxes. The royal government borrowed heavily to fund wars and paid interest on that debt, using revenue gathered almost entirely from people who owned the least. Grain prices could double in a bad harvest, and wages did not follow. Yet the system continued, year after year, as if it were the only possible way to organize 26 million people. But it was not inevitable, it was specific. And the longer it continued, the clearer it became that what appeared stable was only holding still. France, in the 1780s, was the largest economy in Western Europe. 75 to 80% of the labor force worked in agriculture. Most of the rest worked in textiles, iron production, or small-scale craft trades. A minority worked in colonial trade, which moved sugar, coffee, and enslaved people through a few port cities. This was not a primitive economy. It produced significant output, but that output did not translate into state revenue. The problem was not volume, it was structure. 35 to 40% of the land was owned by nobility. Another 10% belonged to the church. Most peasants either rented land or owned plots so small that they also had to lease additional fields to survive. Rent was paid in kind or coin, depending on the region. On top of rent, peasants paid royal taxes, seigneurial dues, and fees to use the local mill or wine press. These payments were not optional. The primary direct tax, the taille, fell almost exclusively on commoners. Nobles and clergy were largely exempt. Regional salt taxes, called the gabelle, varied wildly. In some provinces, salt cost 6 times what it did in others. Internal customs barriers fragmented the domestic market, raising the cost of moving goods between regions. And because much of the tax system was managed through private contractors, who paid the crown up front and then collected from the population, the system prioritized immediate extraction over economic efficiency. Agricultural productivity had stagnated. There was little incentive to invest in improvement when most surplus was claimed by landlords, tax farmers, or the state. The result was an economy that could not grow its tax base, and a government that could not increase revenue without squeezing harder. By 1788, the royal deficit stood at roughly 126 million livres. Interest payments on accumulated debt consumed about half of annual state expenditure. The kingdom was not bankrupt in a technical sense. It still collected taxes. It still paid soldiers, but it could not finance itself without either raising taxes on those already taxed or convincing those with exemptions to contribute. It tried neither successfully. Daily life reflected this fiscal grid. A rural family's year revolved around the harvest. 60 to 70% of their caloric intake came from bread, usually made from rye or cheaper grains. A poor harvest meant prices spiked. A laborer in Paris might earn 20 to 30 sous per day in the 1780s. A 4-pound loaf of bread could cost 8 sous in a normal year and 16 in a bad one. That left little room for rent, fuel, or clothing. Urban workers faced a different but related problem. Their wages were paid daily and were highly unstable. Seasonal layoffs were common. Employment in construction, textiles, or transport depended on demand that fluctuated with rural incomes. When grain prices rose, rural families stopped buying manufactured goods. Urban workshops cut hours. Workers who had migrated to cities for wages found themselves economically worse off than they had been in the countryside, but without the option to return easily. The commercial middle class, lawyers, merchants, office holders, operated in a different economic layer. They earned income from trade, legal services, or positions purchased from the crown. Many invested in land or bought offices that conferred noble status over generations. These offices were expensive, but they also exempted holders from certain taxes and provided pensions or salaries from the state. This created a class of people whose wealth depended on the fiscal system continuing to function, even as that system grew more fragile. Nobles, at the top of the structure, derived income primarily from land rents and state pensions. They paid little indirect taxes. Many depended on royal patronage for a significant portion of their income. When the state faced fiscal crisis, it threatened not only its own operations, but the income streams of those most insulated from taxation. The structure created predictable constraints. A peasant family could not save enough to buy land. A young man could not move to a city without guild membership, which required fees, connections, or years of apprenticeship. A woman could not inherit property equally with her brothers in most regions. Legal contracts were costly to enforce and required access to courts that were slow, distant, and expensive. Literacy rates in the 1780s were roughly 47% for men and 27% for women. This was not merely a cultural gap, it was an information gap. News of grain prices, tax changes, or fiscal reforms spread slowly and unevenly. Markets could not function efficiently when price signals took weeks to travel, and when many participants could not read posted rates. Censorship controlled printed complaints about taxation. Economic grievances were not easily coordinated across regions. The cost of organizing collective action was high. The risk of punishment, fines, detention, loss of trading privileges was real. As a result, economic behavior under pressure took quieter forms. Household debt rose after bad harvests. Families borrowed from neighbors, local merchants, or wealthier landowners. Repayment schedules stretched across years. When debt could not be serviced, families delayed marriages, sold tools, or sent children to work as servants in other households. These were not cultural choices. They were economic responses to income shocks in a system with no public credit for the poor and no insurance against crop failure. Some families migrated, despite the risks. Moving to a city meant losing access to common lands and village networks. Staying meant accepting extraction with no prospect of accumulation. Tax evasion through undeclared income or informal trade was common, but it carried the risk of fines that could erase a year's earnings. None of this was loudly disruptive. It was adaptation within narrow options. The system appeared stable because it had lasted for generations. Peasants paid, nobles collected, the crown borrowed, the cycle repeated. But the appearance of continuity masked structural fragility. The state could not expand its revenue base without confronting exemptions that were legally entrenched and politically defended. It could not reduce spending without cutting military capacity or defaulting on debt, both of which threatened external security and internal credit. It could not stimulate economic growth without reforming the very privileges that constituted its administrative foundation. Attempts at reform in the 1770s and 1780s repeatedly failed. Proposed changes to the tax system met resistance from parliaments, noble assemblies, and provincial estates. The administrative apparatus was too fragmented to implement uniform policy. Tax farmers had contractual rights. Guilds defended monopolies. The legal privileges of clergy and nobility were not merely social status, they were property rights embedded in law and backed by centuries of precedent. The system could extract, it could survive poor harvests, wars, and fiscal strain. But it could not adapt. What it could not do was grow tax revenue without confronting exemption. It could not enforce uniform law across regions with conflicting legal codes. It could not create a national market without dismantling internal tariffs that generated revenue for private contractors and provincial authorities. It could not reduce the cost of credit without institutional reforms that would require cooperation from the very groups most resistant to change. These were not moral failures. They were structural limits built into the fiscal and legal architecture of the state. The peasant family wakes again. The field is still not theirs. The bread is still taxed. The harvest will come, or it will not. The system continues because it has not yet stopped. Nothing here was inevitable. It was simply structured this way. And structure, when it cannot bend, does not warn you before it breaks. Until the late 1780s, when daily life collided with the limits of the structure beneath it, is how the French Revolution began.